Storytelling is one of the most important foundations in the elementary classroom.
One of my favorite descriptions of our job is that we are storytellers of the truth. And we weave storytelling in from the first day of school and into every type of lesson that we give.
We give 5 great stories throughout the year, and we give these lessons every single year. It's almost a ritual in the classroom. The whole class gathers. It's a very special event. We set up often many demonstrations. Most of the time when we give lessons, it's small groups, so it's a big deal for the whole class to get together and watch something.
And these stories are shared starting with their very first year in lower elementary and then every year again until they leave upper elementary. So they really do become a ritual for the class.
In between these stories, we're also telling smaller stories. If we're looking at the first story, which we'll talk about more in a minute, we might also be giving little tiny stories as lessons throughout that week when we present that first story.
The 5 great stories, the first one is about the creation of the universe. And the second is, we call the timeline of life, or the coming of life, and it's how life came and evolved on Earth. The third one is the coming of human beings, so how we arrived. And then the last 2 are around the special inventions that humans brought with them and kind of created together, language and mathematics.
The first story is very, very fun, especially for the youngest students, because it involves quite a few science demonstrations, their favorite of which is the volcano. So we go into basic physics, how particles have special laws that everything has to follow, the gradual forming of and cooling of the Earth, with quite a few demonstrations, and then they can repeat those afterwards. And then those demonstrations lead into more materials that are on the shelf, more lessons that we're presenting to them. What are the properties of gases, liquids, and solids, magnetism, gravity, looking at planetary bodies and how they were created, orbits, all kinds of things can spiral out from that first story.
They love the science experiments
They
from
do.
that one.
Yes, independent science is a must, so they can get their goggles out and do the volcano over and over again.
It's good reading practice too, because we have science command cards in the classroom, and so all the experiments are written out for them, and they're welcome to follow along with the cards, and they have all the instructions that are needed, all the materials that are needed to.
They have to gather everything and find it, which is great sequencing skills and things like that too.
Yeah. The second one that we share is the coming of life, and this is a really long timeline that shows all of the periods of Earth's history and the different animals that appeared or disappeared at different times. There's a little bit about plate tectonics in that one as well. It shows how the landforms on Earth have changed over time. And then the very last one is humans.
They might get really excited about the extinction events. Of course,
trilobites.
They love dinosaurs. They could do dinosaur research for 3 months after that lesson, or for years with some of them sometimes. There's tons of creatures to discover. When you present these stories, you always provide the tools for them for independent research. Sometimes we give stories from the timeline that we present. Sometimes we might just give a story of one animal and go very deeply into that story. We might introduce like a story folder, which has more information about it. We might encourage them to write simple reports or more complicated reports, depending on their age.
Yeah, the cool thing is that there are so many pictures on it that relate to all sorts of animals that have existed at some point in Earth's history. And there's a story about each one. Every single picture has something else that we can share about it, even if we have to go research it, because they ask, what is this? I'm like, give me a second. I'll get back to you tomorrow. Yeah, we'll have a lesson tomorrow on that one. But I've given a lesson on sponges so many times because we have a sponge in the classroom and the sponge picture is really cool. So for whatever reason, that's the one that comes up a lot with us.
The third story, the story of human beings, follows pretty soon after the coming of life. And this story sort of focuses on
gratitude.
Yeah, and early humans, but it's also this idea that those humans had the same sort of gifts that we have. They were just in a different environment. So how did they adapt to the environment that they were in? And how did they gradually sort of provide these things for us that we use today? And then we also branch into these lessons about fundamental human needs. Yeah. So, defense, housing, transportation, nourishment, basic things that, someone anywhere in the world needs and uses. And so they can get into a lot of cultural explorations, not just of early humans from this lesson, but of just cultures that are different from their own. We call them either vertical or horizontal studies, looking at transportation, through the ages, or looking at one culture and then finding how they meet all of their needs. there's a lot of different ways that you can explore.
And the other side to those material needs of the fundamental needs of humans are the spiritual needs. And so we talk about how all of those things like nourishment and clothing and housing during inclement weather, all of that is necessary to stay alive. But it's not enough to offer a robust life. And so we talk about the needs of humans that go beyond that. We talk about culture, we talk about art, we talk about even vanity, right? If we wear earrings or whatever, dyeing our hair, right? These types of things that we use to enrich life. And then it's fun for the children to talk about what they do. Usually art comes up a lot, right? Or what musical instrument they're playing.
Religion too, you know, different ways that human beings have met those needs. And there's so many stories. Like, we could get into mythologies from around the world. You know, everything is at this age, and they're so hungry for stories that it's a really great way to get them going on what they're curious about. The fourth one, this is my favorite, is the introduction of the alphabet, the invention of the alphabet. So this story actually changes depending on where you're giving it. So if I were in China, my story of the alphabet would be very different. But our story starts from where English's roots are and goes through. And it's just this idea that they can look at this alphabet that we have today and realize that every single book in the classroom, everything they've ever read, you know, is just these symbols. And this always invites exploration of other alphabets. You know, I still have children. I give that story in October. I still have children writing in hieroglyphics in my classroom, or, you know, inventing their own alphabets, or looking at maybe their family speaks another language and comparing their alphabet with, you know, the English alphabet, or sharing a language with someone else. It's always a really fun exploration.
And the last story is about numbers and mathematics and how numbers have changed throughout the years. And we start with just counting and how people would make notches on a stick or collect pebbles in their hands to keep track of 1 to 1 if you need to, keep track of numbers for any reason. And then that became increasingly sophisticated as civilizations changed. And we talk about, I think my favorite chart of that one is the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had different carvings for numbers, and the million is a man in astonishment holding his hands up, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how big a million is, which is pretty fun. And then we talk about how, while that was really cool, it was hard, maybe it'd be hard to add that way, or it'd be hard to multiply that way. And so we talk about the Greek and Roman numerals. I always have students then who become obsessed with Roman numerals and try to multiply within Roman numerals, but there's no zero, so that makes life hard. So we talk about how zero came to be, and then the Arabic numerals that we use, and how much simpler our current system is compared to what some of the people in antiquity used.
With the older children, sometimes you can get into concepts like the idea that not all number systems use base 10, or that kind of place value. They exchanged, the Babylonians, 60 was their number that they exchanged to. So you can get into some really complex mathematical concepts just from the stories that, we're sharing of culture and history.